At 72, Jack Holloway knew the ache of coming home to an empty house, where memories hung in every corner like old photographs. His wife's coffee cup still sat by the kitchen sink, unwashed, because washing it felt like letting go of the last piece of her. That morning, while fishing the familiar Maine waters, Jack spotted something that would change everything. An old boat drifting alone in the fog. The vessel looked ancient, with peeling paint and weathered wood that seemed to whisper of forgotten times. When Jack climbed aboard, he found a trunk hidden in the captain's quarters. Inside were things that shouldn't exist. A woman's locket with the Titanic's crest, a journal from 1912, and photographs of people from his grandmother's bedtime stories. The journal belonged to Eleanor Holloway, his great-grandmother, who supposedly died in Ireland, not aboard the most famous ship in history. How was this possible? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The brass compass in Jack's weathered hands caught the first rays of dawn, filtering through his kitchen window. He'd carried it home from the mysterious boat the night before, unable to shake the feeling that it was somehow meant for him. The compass needle spun wildly, as if searching for a direction that no longer existed on any map. Jack set the compass on the kitchen table beside Martha's untouched coffee cup and rubbed his eyes. Sleep had eluded him entirely. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Eleanor's handwriting in that impossible journal, her words flowing across pages that should have turned to dust decades ago. The kitchen still smelled faintly of Martha's lavender soap, even though she'd been gone 8 months now. Jack had kept everything exactly as she'd left it. Her reading glasses on the counter, her gardening gloves by the back door, her favorite mug waiting for coffee that would never come. His daughter Lisa called it unhealthy. His son Michael suggested grief counseling, but they didn't understand that moving Martha's things would be like erasing the last traces of 37 years together. Outside, Lobster Cove was waking up. Jack could hear the distant rumble of diesel engines as the younger fishermen prepared their boats for the day. Once, he would have been among them, but at 72, he fished more for the solitude than the catch. The routine gave him something to do with his hands, while his mind wrestled with the emptiness. He picked up the compass again, noting the intricate engravings around its edge. Ships, waves, and what looked like a woman's profile were etched into the brass with remarkable detail. This wasn't some cheap souvenir. It was crafted by someone who understood the sea. The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. "Jack, you out there?" Tom's gravelly voice filled the kitchen. Tom Patterson had been the harbour master for 23 years and knew every boat that entered or left Lobster Cove. "I'm here, Tom. Got a call from the Coast Guard this morning. They're asking about an unregistered vessel spotted in our waters yesterday. Old wooden boat, maybe 60 feet, no identification numbers. You see anything like that on your run?" Jack's grip tightened on the compass. "Might have seen something out near the banks." "Why?" "Well, that's the strange part. According to their radar, the boat was there 1 minute and gone the next, like it just vanished. They want to know if anyone boarded it or saw where it went." "I'll keep an eye out," Jack said, though he had no intention of mentioning his discovery to the authorities. Something about the boat and its contents felt deeply personal, like a message meant only for him. After Tom hung up, Jack walked to his study, a small room Martha had insisted he needed for his projects. She'd always been encouraging his interests, even when they seemed to lead nowhere. The walls were lined with books about local history, maritime disasters, and family genealogy. Martha had teased him about becoming the town historian in his retirement. He pulled out a thick folder labeled Family Records and spread its contents across his desk. Birth certificates, immigration papers, and a few faded photographs told the story of the Holloway family's journey from Ireland to Maine. At the center of it all was the story his grandmother had told him countless times as a boy. "Your great-grandmother. Eleanor was the bravest woman who ever lived," she'd said, her Irish accent still thick despite decades in America. She died bringing your grandfather into this world, but not before she made sure he'd have a better life than anything Ireland could offer. She sacrificed everything for family, Jack. That's what Holloways do. But Eleanor's journal told a different story entirely. Jack opened it to the first entry, dated April 15th, 1912. The water is so cold I cannot feel my fingers as I write this. I am alive when I should be dead, saved by a miracle I do not deserve. The screams have finally stopped, but they echo in my mind like church bells. I must record what happened for William and for the child I carry. If I do not survive what comes next, perhaps someone will understand why I made the choices I did. Jack's hands trembled as he read. His grandmother had never mentioned William, and she certainly hadn't said anything about Eleanor surviving the Titanic. According to family law, Eleanor had died in childbirth in County Cork, and Jack's grandfather had been raised by relatives before eventually making his way to America. He reached for the locket he'd found in the trunk. The gold was tarnished but intact, with RMS Titanic engraved in elegant script on the back. Inside was a photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and dark hair pinned up in the fashion of the early 1900s. She looked remarkably like Jack's daughter Lisa, the same determined set to her jaw. A knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, he saw Sarah Chen standing on his porch, holding a covered dish and looking uncertain. Sarah ran the Lobster Cove Historical Society and had been Martha's friend for years. Since the funeral, she'd made a point of checking on Jack regularly, though he suspected Martha had asked her to keep an eye on him. "Morning, Sarah," he said, opening the door. "You're out early." "I brought you some of that fish chowder you liked at the church supper," she said, holding out the dish. "I was hoping we could talk about something. I've been doing research on the Titanic for a presentation next month, and I came across some records that might interest you." Jack's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. "What kind of records?" "Passenger manifests, mostly. I found several people with Irish surnames who survived, but never made it into the official histories. It made me think about all the stories that got lost over time." She paused, studying his face. "You look tired, Jack. Are you sleeping?" "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "I'd like to hear about these records." Sarah followed him to the kitchen, where her eyes immediately went to the compass on the table. "That's beautiful. Where did you find it?" "It was my grandfather's," Jack said quickly, then realized he had no idea if that was true or not. "I found it in some old things Martha had packed away." Sarah picked up the compass, turning it over in her hands. "The craftsmanship is exceptional. See these engravings? This kind of detail was common on personal navigational instruments in the early 1900s. Ship officers often had them custom-made." She looked up at him. "Your grandfather was a sailor?" "He might have been," Jack said, realizing how little he actually knew about his family's history. "My grandmother didn't talk much about the old days. That's common with immigrant families. Sometimes the past was too painful to revisit." Sarah set the compass down gently. "Jack, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what was your great-grandmother's name? The one from Ireland?" Jack felt his heart skip. "Eleanor. Eleanor Holloway. Why?" Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "I think I may have found a record of her. And Eleanor Holloway was listed as a third-class passenger on the Titanic. She was traveling alone, which was unusual for a woman in 1912. But here's the interesting part. She's listed as a survivor." The room seemed to spin around Jack. He gripped the edge of the table, trying to process what Sarah was telling him. "That's impossible. My grandmother said Eleanor died in Ireland, giving birth to my grandfather." "Family stories change over time," Sarah said gently. "Sometimes the truth is too complicated or painful to pass down intact. But the records don't lie, and Eleanor Holloway survived the Titanic sinking and was rescued by the Carpathia." Jack stared at the compass, its needle still spinning aimlessly. Everything he thought he knew about his family was crumbling around him, replaced by questions that had no easy answers. Who was William? Why had his grandmother hidden the truth about Eleanor? And most importantly, how had Eleanor's belongings ended up in a mysterious boat floating in the waters where Jack fished every day? "Sarah," he said slowly, "I think there's something you need to see." He led her to his study and showed her the journal, watching her face change as she read Eleanor's words. When she looked up, her expression was a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "Jack, do you understand what this is? This is a first-hand account of the Titanic disaster, written by a survivor. But more than that, this could rewrite what we know about your family's history in America." "I don't know if I want it rewritten," Jack said honestly. "The story my grandmother told me was simple, clean. This is—" He gestured at the journal. "This is complicated." Sarah closed the journal carefully and looked at him with the kind of patience she'd learned from years of dealing with reluctant history. "Jack, I understand this is overwhelming, but Eleanor wrote this for a reason. She wanted someone to know the truth. Maybe that someone is you." Outside, the fog was beginning to lift from the harbor, revealing the familiar sight of fishing boats heading out for the day. Jack watched them through his window and thought about the mysterious vessel that had appeared and vanished like a ghost. Everything about yesterday felt like a dream, but the compass and journal proved it had been real. "Will you help me figure this out?" he asked Sarah. She smiled, and for the first time since Martha's death, Jack felt like he wasn't completely alone. "I'd be honored to help. Eleanor's story deserves to be told." As they sat together in his study, surrounded by the fragments of a family history that was far more complex than either of them had imagined, Jack picked up the compass one more time. Its needle had finally settled, pointing steadily toward something beyond the harbor, beyond the familiar waters where he'd spent his life. It was pointing toward the truth. 3 days later, Jack sat alone in his kitchen as rain drummed against the windows. Sarah had gone to Portland to research Titanic records at the Maritime Museum, leaving him with Eleanor's journal and a growing sense that his entire life had been built on carefully constructed lies. He'd been reading the journal methodically, one entry at a time. But tonight something drove him to skip ahead. His fingers found a page dated April 20th, 1912, 5 days after the disaster. Eleanor's handwriting was steadier here, more determined. "I have made my decision. The world believes Eleanor Holloway died in the North Atlantic, and perhaps that is for the best. The woman I was, the naive girl who believed in fairy tales and happy endings, did die in those freezing waters. What emerged is someone else entirely, someone who must be strong enough to protect what matters most." Jack's coffee grew cold. As he read on, each word reshaping everything he thought he knew about his family. "William thinks I perished with the ship. It is better this way. He has his life in Boston, his family's expectations, his promising future. I will not burden him with the truth of what we created together in those brief, beautiful moments when we thought we had forever. The child I carry is mine alone to protect now." The child, Jack's grandfather. His hands shook as he turned the page. "I have taken the name Margaret O'Brien. The real Margaret died beside me in the water, her papers floating nearby in the darkness. I wrapped them in oilcloth and held them close as we waited for rescue. When the Carpathia's crew asked my name, I gave them hers. Margaret had no family waiting in America, no one to mourn her. Eleanor Holloway's survival would have caused too many complications, asked too many questions I cannot answer." Jack pushed back from the table, his mind reeling. His great-grandmother had stolen a dead woman's identity to disappear. But why? What had she been running from? He found the answer 3 pages later. "William is married. I learned this from a passenger manifest posted in the Red Cross station where survivors were housed. Mr. and Mrs. William Ashworth, traveling together to New York for their honeymoon. I was his secret, his indiscretion before he settled into the life his family had planned for him. The child I carry would be nothing but scandal and shame to him now." The journal slipped from Jack's hands. William Ashworth. He knew that name from somewhere, though he couldn't place it. More importantly, this revelation meant his entire family line was the product of what Eleanor considered a shameful affair. His grandmother's stories about brave Eleanor dying for love suddenly made terrible sense. She hadn't been lying, she'd been protecting a deeper, more painful truth. Eleanor had died in a way. The woman who survived had built a new life on a foundation of deception and sacrifice. Jack picked up the journal again, driven by a need to understand the full scope of what Eleanor had done. "The money William gave me before we boarded the ship, money for pretty dresses and souvenirs," he said, "will have to last until the child is born. I have told the Red Cross I'm traveling to family in Maine. They have arranged passage on a train leaving tomorrow. By the time anyone thinks to look for Margaret O'Brien, she will have vanished as completely as Eleanor Holloway." Maine. So that part was true at least. Eleanor Margaret had made her way to the state where her descendants would eventually call home, but there were still so many gaps in the story. The next entry was dated 3 months later, from a small town Jack didn't recognize. "The child came early, small but strong like his father. I have named him Thomas, after my own father back in Ireland. The doctor says he is healthy, and for that I am grateful. I am less grateful for his questions about where my husband might be. I've told him Thomas's father died on the Titanic, which is not entirely untrue. The William I knew died when I learned about his marriage." Thomas. Jack's grandfather's name had been Thomas Holloway, though the family story claimed he'd been orphaned and raised by relatives. More lies, apparently, or at least creative revisions of a more complicated truth. The rain outside intensified, matching the storm of emotions building in Jack's chest. Every page revealed new deceptions, new questions about who his family really was. But beneath his frustration he felt something else, a grudging admiration for Eleanor's courage. Alone and pregnant in a foreign country, she'd built a life from nothing. He turned to the final entries, dated from 1913. "Thomas is walking now, curious about everything. He has his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn streak. I have found. Work in a textile mill, and we have a small room above the bakery on Main Street. The owner, Mrs. Sullivan, believes I am a war widow. It is easier than explaining the truth. I think often about the locket I saved from the ship. It belonged to my cabin mate, a kind woman named Catherine, who spoke of her children waiting in New York. She pressed it into my hands as the water rose, begging me to find them if I survived. I never did find them. Perhaps I was too much of a coward, or perhaps I feared what questions my survival might raise. I keep the locket now as a reminder of debts unpaid and promises broken." Jack's breath caught. The locket he'd found in the trunk. It hadn't belonged to Eleanor at all. It had belonged to another passenger, someone whose children had waited in vain for news that never came. The Titanic crest made sense now. It hadn't been Eleanor's souvenir, but a dying woman's desperate plea. The final entry was brief and dated. "December 1913. I have decided to reclaim the Holloway name for Thomas. Margaret O'Brien served her purpose, but I want my son to know he comes from somewhere, even if that somewhere is built on secrets. I have written letters to cousins in Ireland, telling them Margaret O'Brien died in childbirth and that Thomas is all that remains of Eleanor's legacy. It is a final lie, but perhaps a necessary one. The boy deserves a family name he can be proud of." Jack closed the journal and sat in the silence of his kitchen, processing the magnitude of what he'd learned. His great-grandmother hadn't just survived the Titanic. She'd used the disaster to disappear completely, building an entirely new identity to protect herself and her child from scandal. His grandfather had grown up believing his mother died bringing him into the world, never knowing she'd lived her entire life carrying the weight of secrets and sacrifice. But what haunted Jack most was the realization that Eleanor's deception had worked almost perfectly. 3 generations later, her descendants lived comfortable lives built on the foundation of her lies. Would they have been better off knowing the truth? Would he? The phone rang, jarring him back to the present. Sarah's Voice was excited when he answered. Jack, I found something incredible at the museum. There are records of survivors who were never officially documented, people who disappeared after the rescue. But there's more. I found a reference to William Ashworth in the Boston shipping records. He was from a wealthy family, owned a shipping company, and Jack, he had descendants. There might be people alive today who are connected to your family. Jack stared at Eleanor's journal, thinking about the pain in her words when she wrote about William's marriage. Sarah, I don't think that's a path we should go down. But don't you want to know? There could be relatives you've never met, family history you've never heard. I'm beginning to think some family history is meant to stay buried, Jack said, quietly. Eleanor had her reasons for disappearing. Maybe we should respect them. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. What did you find in the journal, Jack? He looked out at the rain, thinking about the mysterious boat that had brought Eleanor's secrets back to the surface after more than a century. I found out that the truth isn't always better than the story we tell ourselves. After he hung up, Jack sat alone with the weight of Eleanor's revelations. Outside, the storm was getting worse, and he wondered if somewhere out in those dark waters, the mysterious boat was still drifting, waiting for the next person who needed to learn that some secrets were heavier than the ocean itself. Sarah returned from Portland the next morning with a manila folder thick with photocopied documents and a look of barely contained excitement. She found Jack in his study, surrounded by genealogy books and old family photographs, the mysterious compass spinning lazily on his desk. I know you said some secrets should stay buried, she began, settling into the chair across from him. But I think you need to see what I found. Jack looked up from a photograph of his grandfather as a young man. Thomas Holloway had his father's eyes, just as Eleanor had written, but now Jack could see something else in his expression. A wariness that suggested he'd carried his own secrets. What kind of documents? Sarah opened the folder and pulled out a torn piece of paper, its edges brown with age. This is a fragment of the original Titanic passenger manifest. Look at line 47. Jack leaned forward and saw it. Holloway, Eleanor, 3rd class, Ireland to New York. But there was something odd about the entry. A thick black line had been drawn through Eleanor's name, and in the margin someone had written, "Deceased confirmed." Someone deliberately crossed her out, Sarah said. But here's the interesting part. It wasn't done by the ship's crew or the rescue workers. The ink is different, and it was added later. Someone wanted Eleanor Holloway's survival removed from the official record. Jack studied the document, noting how the crossing out was more deliberate than accidental. Eleanor herself, maybe, if she was trying to disappear. That's what I thought at first. But look at this. Sarah produced another document. This one, from the American Red Cross. This is a list of survivors processed in New York after the rescue. No Eleanor Holloway, but there's a Margaret O'Brien listed as traveling to family in Maine. No further contact requested. The pieces were falling into place, confirming what Jack had read in the journal. Eleanor had successfully erased herself from history, becoming Margaret O'Brien so completely that even official records supported her new identity. I spent 3 hours going through immigration records, Sarah continued. No Margaret O'Brien matching Eleanor's description ever entered the country legally. But there are gaps in the records from that period, especially for Irish immigrants. It would have been possible for someone determined enough to slip through the cracks. Jack picked up the compass again, watching its needle search for true north. You're saying she not only survived the Titanic, but managed to disappear so completely that she became a ghost? More than that. I think she had help. Sarah pulled out a business card, yellowed with age. I found this tucked into one of the Red Cross files. Michael Sullivan, Immigration Services, discreet assistance for new Americans. Someone was helping survivors create new identities. It wasn't uncommon. The Titanic disaster created a lot of confusion, and there were people who took advantage. of that chaos. Some charged money to help survivors start fresh, especially if they had reasons to avoid publicity. Sarah paused. Jack, I think Eleanor paid someone to erase Eleanor Holloway and create Margaret O'Brien. The implications hit Jack like a cold wave. His great-grandmother hadn't just been running from scandal. She'd been so desperate to disappear that she'd turned to what amounted to criminal activity. The woman his grandmother had described as a saint had been involved with forgers and identity thieves. There's something else, Sarah said gently. I made some phone calls to historical societies in Boston. The Ashworth family, Williams family, they're still prominent there, still own shipping companies, still have money and influence. And Jack, they have their own version of family history that includes William's tragic death on the Titanic. Jack felt his stomach drop. He died? According to their family records, William Ashworth perished when the ship went down. He's listed on their family monument as lost at sea, April 15th, 1912. But the passenger manifest shows him surviving. So he lied to his own family about dying. It's the only explanation that makes sense. William and Eleanor both used the disaster to fake their deaths and start over. The difference is, William went back to his old life and pretended the whole thing never happened. Eleanor built a completely new one. Jack stood and walked to the window, looking out at the harbor where normal people were going about their normal lives, unburdened by the weight of secrets that stretched back over a century. Why are you telling me this, Sarah? What am I supposed to do with it? I don't know, she admitted, but I think Eleanor wanted someone to know the truth eventually. Why else would her things end up in a boat that you, specifically you, would find? It was a question that had been haunting Jack since the moment he'd climbed aboard that mysterious vessel. The odds of him finding Eleanor's belongings by random chance seemed impossible. Someone or something had wanted him to discover the truth about his family. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Lisa's name appeared on the caller ID, and Jack reluctantly answered. "Dad, I'm worried about you," his daughter said without preamble. "Michael said you've been acting strange, asking weird questions about family history. Are you okay?" Jack looked at Sarah, who was pretending not to listen while organizing her documents. "I'm fine, honey, just doing some research." "Research into what? Dad, you've never cared about genealogy before, and Mrs. Patterson said she saw you talking to some woman about old documents. Are you sure you're not?" Lisa paused. "Are you sure this isn't about Mom? Sometimes when people are grieving, they get obsessed with finding connections to the past." The concern in his daughter's voice cut deep. Lisa was a nurse, trained to spot the warning signs of depression and unhealthy coping mechanisms. From her perspective, a recently widowed man suddenly obsessing over century-old family secrets probably looked like classic avoidance behavior. "I'm not having a breakdown, if that's what you're worried about," Jack said. "I found some old family documents that raised questions. I'm just trying to understand where we came from." "What kind of documents?" Jack looked at Eleanor's journal, still open on his desk. How could he explain to his practical, no-nonsense daughter that he'd found their great-great-grandmother's secret diary in a ghost ship? "Just some papers that suggest our family history might be more complicated than we thought." "Dad, does this have anything to do with that boat the Coast Guard was asking about? Tom Patterson said they questioned you." Jack's pulse quickened. He'd forgotten about Tom's call and the Coast Guard's interest in the mysterious vessel. What did Tom tell them? Just that you might have seen something. "Dad, you didn't board some random boat you found floating around, did you? That's incredibly dangerous." "I'm a fisherman, Lisa. I know how to handle myself around boats. You're a 72-year-old fisherman who's been acting strangely since Mom died. Promise me you're not taking unnecessary risks." Jack looked at the compass, its needle still pointing toward unknown territory. Everything about this situation was an unnecessary risk. Diving into family secrets that had been buried for good reason, trusting documents that could be forgeries, putting his faith in a woman he barely knew. But for the first time since Martha's death, he felt like he had a purpose beyond just existing. "I promise I'm being careful," he said. "And Lisa, I promise I'm not losing my mind." After he hung up, Sarah looked at him with understanding eyes. "Your family's worried about you. They think I'm having some kind of grief-induced breakdown. Maybe they're right. Or maybe you're the first person in your family brave enough to ask the hard questions." Sarah gathered her documents and stood. "Jack, I want to help you figure this out, but only if you're sure you want to know the truth. Some stories don't have happy endings." Jack picked up the photograph of his grandfather again, studying Thomas Holloway's serious expression. Had he ever wondered about his mother's death? Had he ever suspected there was more to the story than he'd been told? "Eleanor kept these secrets for a reason," Jack said finally, "but she also preserved them. If she wanted them to stay buried forever, she would have destroyed everything. Instead, she put them in a trunk and somehow made sure they'd find their way back to her family," Sarah smiled. "So we keep digging." Jack nodded, though part of him wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. "We keep digging." 2 weeks later, Jack stood in the basement of the Portland Immigration Museum, holding a document that changed everything. Sarah had arranged access to their restricted archives, and what they'd found there made Eleanor's story even more incredible and more troubling. The Ellis Island paperwork was yellowed and fragile, but the details were clear. On June 3, 1912, nearly 2 months after the Titanic disaster, a woman named Margaret O'Brien had entered the United States through Boston rather than New York. The photograph stapled to the document showed Eleanor's face, but the signature was in handwriting that didn't match her journal. "Someone else filled out these forms," Sarah said, pointing to the careful script. "Look at the G in Margaret. It's completely different from how Eleanor writes in her journal." Jack studied the immigration document under the museum's magnifying glass. So she really did have help. Professional help. More than that. This level of documentation would have cost serious money in 1912. Someone invested heavily in Eleanor's new identity. Sarah pulled out another file. "I also found this, a birth certificate for Margaret O'Brien, dated 1890 in County Cork. It's perfect except for one thing." "What?" "The real Margaret O'Brien died in 1911, a full year before the Titanic sailed. Whoever created Eleanor's new identity was thorough enough to find a dead woman whose age and background matched what Eleanor needed." Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the museum's air conditioning. "You're saying there was an entire network of people helping Titanic survivors disappear?" "I'm saying Eleanor got involved with some very sophisticated criminals. The kind of people who could make someone vanish completely for the right price. They spent the rest of the morning going through immigration records, looking for other survivors who might have used similar services. What they found was disturbing. At least 7 other Titanic passengers had entered the country under questionable identities in the months following the disaster, all through different ports, all with documentation that was technically perfect, but historically impossible. "It makes sense, in a horrible way," Sarah said as they drove back to Lobster Cove. "The Titanic created chaos. Families were separated, records were destroyed, and hundreds of people were suddenly displaced with no way to prove who they were. Perfect conditions for someone running an identity-changing operation." Jack stared out at the ocean, thinking about Eleanor's desperation. She must have been terrified to get involved with people like that, or determined enough to do whatever it took to protect her child. Sarah glanced at him. "Jack, I need to ask you something. Have you considered that Eleanor might not have been entirely innocent in all this?" "What do you mean?" "Think about it. A young Irish woman traveling alone on the Titanic, with enough money to pay for expensive forged documents after she survived. Where did that money come from? You said her journal mentioned William giving her money for pretty dresses and souvenirs, but that sounds like a lot more than pocket change." Jack had wondered about the same thing. Eleanor's journal described her as working in a textile mill after Thomas was born, hardly the kind of job that would have paid for the sophisticated identity fraud she'd obviously purchased. "You think she was already involved in something illegal?" "I think there's a lot about Eleanor's story that doesn't add up. and I think the answers might be uncomfortable. When they reached Jack's house, they found Michael's car in the driveway. Jack's son was sitting on the front porch, looking like a man preparing for a difficult conversation. "Dad, we need to talk," Michael said without getting up. He was a lawyer, used to cutting straight to the point. "Lisa told me about your conversation last week, and I've been doing some thinking." Jack felt his defenses rise. "If this is about my mental health, it's about your safety. Dad, you're 72 years old and you're chasing after some century-old mystery that may or may not be real. You've been talking to strangers about family documents that could be worth serious money, and you've been boarding abandoned boats without telling anyone where you're going." Sarah stepped forward. "Mr. Holloway, I'm Sarah Chen from the Historical Society. Your father has been helping me with some research." "I know who you are," Michael said, standing up, "and I appreciate your interest in local history, but my father has been through a lot this year, and I'm concerned that this project might not be the best thing for him right now." Jack felt a familiar frustration building. Since Martha's death, his children had treated him like he was made of glass, ready to shatter at the first sign of stress. "Michael, I'm not having a breakdown. I found some family documents that raise questions, and Sarah has been helping me research them." "What kind of documents?" Michael's lawyer instincts were kicking in. "Dad, if someone is trying to involve you in some kind of fraud or scam, nobody's trying to scam me." Jack pulled out his keys and headed for the front door. "Come inside, both of you. It's time you saw what I found." In his study, Jack showed Michael the journal, the locket, and the compass. He watched his son's expression change from skepticism to confusion to something approaching concern as he read Eleanor's words. "Dad, where exactly did you find these things?" Jack told him about the mysterious boat, leaving out the part about it vanishing from Coast Guard radar. Even so, Michael looked increasingly troubled. "You boarded an unknown vessel without backup or communication? Dad, that's incredibly dangerous. What if something had happened to you out there?" "But nothing did happen, and I found these." Jack gestured to Eleanor's belongings. "Michael, this is our family history, real history, not the stories we've been telling ourselves." Michael picked up the immigration document Sarah had copied. As a lawyer, he was trained to spot forged paperwork, and Jack could see him noting the same inconsistencies they'd discovered. "This documentation is sophisticated," he said slowly. "Too sophisticated for someone to create casually. If this is real, your great-grandmother was involved with serious criminals." "That's what we think too," Sarah said. "But the question is why? What was Eleanor running from that made her willing to risk everything?" Michael looked at his father with new understanding. "Dad, if these documents are authentic, they could be historically significant. Museums would pay serious money for first-hand Titanic survivor accounts, but they could also be dangerous if the wrong people find out you have them." "What do you mean dangerous?" "I mean, if Eleanor was involved with identity fraud and document forgery, there might be people who have reasons to keep those secrets buried. People with resources and motivation to protect their families' reputations." Jack thought about William Ashworth and the wealthy Boston family that believed their ancestor had died heroically on the Titanic. How far would they go to protect that version of their history? "So what are you saying? That I should just put everything back in the trunk and pretend I never found it?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, studying the compass that still spun aimlessly on Jack's desk. "I'm saying that if you're going to pursue this, you need to be smart about it, and you need to let your family help you." For the first time since he'd found Eleanor's belongings, Jack felt like someone understood why this mattered to him. "You think I should keep digging?" "I think Mom would have wanted you to follow this through," Michael said quietly. "She always said you had a good instinct for people, and if you think Eleanor wanted her story told, then maybe it's time someone listened to her." Sarah smiled. "Does this mean we have your blessing to continue the research?" Michael looked at his father, seeing something in Jack's expression that had been missing since Martha's funeral. "It means I'm going to help you do it safely, but Dad, no more mysterious boats without backup, okay? Jack nodded, though he had a feeling that Eleanor's secrets were far from finished with him. Somewhere out in the Atlantic, the mysterious vessel was still drifting, and Jack suspected it wasn't done delivering surprises. The bundle of letters Sarah found in the Boston Public Library's rare documents collection was tied with a faded blue ribbon that crumbled at her touch. The librarian had been reluctant to let them examine the papers, which were part of a private donation from the Ashworth family estate, but Sarah's credentials from the Historical Society had opened doors that would have remained closed to Jack. These were donated in 1965, the librarian explained, when the family cleared out their Beacon Hill mansion. Most of it was business correspondence, but there were some personal items mixed in. The family asked that they be held for 50 years before being made available to researchers. Jack's hands trembled as he opened the first letter. The handwriting was unmistakably Eleanor's, but the tone was different from her journal, warmer, more hopeful, filled with the kind of intimacy that spoke of deep affection. "My dearest William," the letter began, dated March 15th, 1912. "The days until we sail grow shorter, and my heart grows fuller knowing that soon we will be together in America, where no one knows our story and we can write our own ending. You speak of your family's expectations, but surely they will understand when they meet me. Love conquers all obstacles, does it not? Your devoted Eleanor." She had no idea he was married, Sarah said softly, reading over Jack's shoulder. "Look at the date. This was written a month before they sailed." She was still believing in their fairy tale. Jack opened the second letter, dated just days before the Titanic's departure. Eleanor's handwriting was more hurried here, as if she'd been excited or nervous. "William, I have such wonderful news I can barely contain it. We are to be 3 instead of 2 on our journey to America. I know this changes our plans, but surely it is a sign that we are meant to be together. Our child will be born in the land of opportunity, free from the shadows of the past. I cannot wait to see your face when I tell you properly. All my love, Eleanor." The third letter was different. Eleanor's careful script had given way to something more desperate, written in what looked like pencil rather than ink. "William, you have avoided me since I told you about the child. I understand your shock, but we must talk before we reach New York. I have nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. You promised we would face everything together. Do not abandon me now when I need you most. Please find me before it is too late. Eleanor." Jack set the letter down, his heart aching for the young woman who'd written these words. She was alone on that ship carrying his child, and he was avoiding her. "It gets worse," Sarah said, holding up the fourth letter. "This one is from William to his brother, dated April 10th, the day before the Titanic sailed." William's handwriting was bold and confident, the script of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Charles, the Irish girl has become a problem. She has convinced herself that our dalliance was something more serious than it was, and now she speaks of marriage and shared futures. I've tried to make her understand that our arrangement was temporary, but she persists in her delusions. By the time you read this, I will be safely married to Catherine and sailing to New York for our honeymoon. The Irish girl is traveling on the same ship, but in third class where she belongs. I trust this distance will help her accept reality. When we reach America, I will give her some money to start fresh and consider the matter closed. William. Jack felt sick. Eleanor hadn't been William's beloved. She'd been his discarded mistress, abandoned and pregnant, while he honeymooned with his actual wife, just a few decks above her. "There's one more," Sarah said quietly. She handed him a letter in different handwriting, feminine and educated. "Mr. Ashworth, my name is Catherine, and I am your brother's wife. I am writing to tell you that William is dead, lost, when the Titanic went down. Before he died, he told me about the Irish girl and the child she carries. He was consumed with guilt about how he had treated her, and he made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would ensure she was cared for. I have enclosed the sum of $500, which represents William's inheritance from our grandfather. Please see that it reaches Miss Holloway with the message that William died, thinking of her and their child, and wishing he had been a better man. Mrs. Catherine Ashworth. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. William hadn't faked his death to escape his past. He had actually died on the Titanic. But his widow had tried to make things right, sending money to Eleanor with a message that transformed William from a cad into a tragic hero. $500 in 1912, Sarah said. That's enough to buy forged documents, pay for safe passage, and start a new life. Catherine Ashworth funded Eleanor's disappearance. Jack stared at the letters, thinking about the elaborate story his grandmother had told him about Eleanor's sacrifice and William's tragic love. It hadn't been entirely false, just edited to remove the painful parts about abandonment and deception. Eleanor never knew the money came from William's wife, he realized. She probably thought he'd left it for her before he died, which explains why she was able to speak of him with love in her journal, even after everything that happened. She died believing he had tried to take care of her. They sat in silence for several minutes, absorbing the full scope of the tragedy. Eleanor hadn't just survived the Titanic. She'd survived betrayal, abandonment, and the kind of heartbreak that could have destroyed a lesser person. Instead, she'd used Catherine Ashworth's guilt money to build a life for herself and her child. There's something else, Sarah said, pulling out a newspaper clipping that had been tucked behind the letters. This is from the Boston Herald, April 1915. Ashworth shipping heir dies in automobile accident. Jack read the brief article about Catherine Ashworth's death 3 years after the Titanic. She kept William's secret even after she died. Look, the obituary says she was survived by no children and makes no mention of any connection to Titanic survivors. She took Eleanor's secret to the grave, Sarah agreed, but she also made sure Eleanor had what she needed to survive. As they left the library, Jack felt the weight of understanding settle over him. His family's story wasn't just about Eleanor's courage or William's betrayal. It was about Catherine Ashworth's quiet act of redemption, funding a new life for the woman her husband had wronged. But it also raised new questions. If Catherine had died in 1915, who else might know about Eleanor's real identity? And more importantly, who else might have reasons to keep that knowledge buried? Jack, Sarah said as they walked to the car, I need to tell you something. I've been getting phone calls. What kind of phone calls? Someone asking about my research into Titanic survivors. They claim to be writing a book, but the questions are very specific. They're asking about survivors who might have assumed false identities. Jack stopped walking. When did this start? 3 days ago, right after I requested access to the Ashworth papers. Sarah looked worried. I think someone knows what we're doing. As they drove back toward Maine, Jack watched the ocean through the passenger window and wondered if Eleanor's secrets were more dangerous than he'd imagined. Somewhere in Boston, someone was taking an interest in his research, and that someone might not want the truth about Eleanor Holloway to see the light of day. The bank document that changed everything was discovered by accident. Sarah had been researching property records in the small Maine town where Eleanor had lived as Margaret O'Brien, when she stumbled across a deed transfer that made no sense according to conventional history. Jack, you need to see this, Sarah said, spreading the yellowed papers across his kitchen table. In 1918, 6 years after the Titanic, Margaret O'Brien inherited a substantial property from someone named Catherine Ashworth. Jack studied the deed, noting the careful legal language that transferred ownership of a 40-acre waterfront estate from Catherine's trust to Eleanor's assumed identity. But Catherine died in 1915. How could she leave property to Eleanor 3 years later? That's what I thought too, until I found this. Sarah produced a copy of Catherine's will, obtained from Boston probate records. Catherine set up a trust before she died, with very specific instructions. The property was to be held for 5 years, then transferred to any woman who can provide documentation of surviving the Titanic disaster and bearing a child to William Ashworth. The implications hit Jack like a physical blow. Catherine knew Eleanor was alive and knew about Thomas. She was still trying to take care of them years after William's death. More than that, look at the property description. Sarah pointed to the legal document. This land is worth millions. Today, it's prime coastal Maine real estate, and according to the deed, it's still held in trust for Eleanor's descendants. Jack felt the room spin slightly. Are you saying? I'm saying you might be one of the wealthiest men in Maine, and you don't even know it. Sarah pulled out a modern property survey she'd obtained from the county records office. The land was never developed, never sold. It's been sitting empty for over a century, managed by a Boston law firm that's been collecting rents from timber rights and coastal access fees. The doorbell rang, interrupting Jack's attempts to process this revelation. Through the window, he saw a man in an expensive suit standing on his porch, holding a briefcase and looking like he meant business. "Mr. Holloway," the man said when Jack opened the door, "my name is Richard Pemberton. I represent certain interests in Boston, and I believe we have some mutual concerns to discuss." Jack's instincts told him to close the door, but something about the man's tone suggested this wasn't a conversation he could avoid. "What kind of concerns? May I come in? I think you'll find what I have to say quite interesting." Against his better judgment, Jack led Pemberton to the living room, where Sarah was hastily gathering the documents they'd been reviewing. Pemberton's eyes went immediately to the papers. "Ms. Chen, I presume. I've been following your research." With great interest. Pemberton's smile was cold and professional. "You've been asking some very specific questions about Titanic survivors and property records." "I'm a historian," Sarah said carefully. "Research is what I do." "Indeed. And your research has led you to some very sensitive information." Pemberton opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Mr. Holloway, I represent the Ashworth Foundation, a charitable organization founded in memory of William and Catherine Ashworth. We've become aware that you've come into possession of certain documents that could be, shall we say, disruptive to several family legacies." Jack felt his anger rising. "What documents are you talking about?" "Letters, journals, immigration records. Items that suggest certain irregularities in how Titanic survivors were processed after the disaster." Pemberton's tone remained polite, but there was steel underneath. "The Foundation has a vested interest in ensuring that the memory of the Ashworth family remains untarnished." "And what does that have to do with me?" Pemberton smiled again, and Jack realized he was looking at a man who was very good at getting what he wanted. "Mr. Holloway, the property that Miss Chen has undoubtedly told you about, the 40 acres left in trust by Catherine Ashworth, there have been some legal complications regarding its ownership." Sarah stood up. "What kind of complications?" "The kind that arise when trusts are based on fraudulent documentation. You see, the original bequest was contingent on providing proof of surviving the Titanic and bearing William Ashworth's child. But if the person claiming that inheritance was using false identity documents, then the entire transfer would be null and void." Jack felt the trap closing around him. "You're saying Eleanor's use of the Margaret O'Brien identity invalidates her claim to the property?" "I'm saying that a woman who committed immigration fraud and identity theft might not be the most reliable basis for a legal inheritance. Courts tend to frown on criminals benefiting from their crimes." The word criminals hung in the air like a challenge. Jack thought about Eleanor, alone and pregnant, making impossible choices to protect her child. She wasn't a criminal. She was a survivor. Perhaps. But survival doesn't excuse fraud, and fraud doesn't create legal inheritance rights. Pemberton pulled out another document. "However, the Foundation is prepared to be reasonable. We're offering To purchase any documents you found related to Eleanor Holloway or Margaret O'Brien for a fair price. Let's say $50,000 for everything. Journals, letters, photographs, anything connected to the Ashworth family. 50,000. Sarah's voice was sharp with disbelief. For documents that could be worth millions? 50,000 for documents that could also be worth nothing if a court determines they're connected to criminal activity. Pemberton's tone never changed. Mr. Holloway, I'm offering you a clean exit from what could become a very messy legal situation. Jack looked at Eleanor's compass, still sitting on his kitchen table where he'd left it. Its needle had finally stopped spinning and was pointing steadily toward the ocean. And if I refuse, then you'll have to prove your great-grandmother's legitimacy in court against some very expensive lawyers who have a century of legal precedent on their side. Identity fraud doesn't improve with age, Mr. Holloway. Sarah moved closer to Jack. This is extortion. This is business, Pemberton corrected. The Ashworth Foundation has a responsibility to protect the family's legacy and ensure that charitable resources aren't diverted by fraudulent claims. What charitable resources? Jack asked. Pemberton hesitated for the first time. The 40 acres you believe you've inherited? It's been designated as a nature preserve, funded by the Ashworth Foundation. Thousands of people benefit from its conservation programs every year. Are you really prepared to destroy that for your own financial gain? Jack realized he was looking at something more complex than simple greed. The Ashworth Foundation wasn't just trying to protect a family reputation. They were protecting a business empire built on charitable work that depended on the family's spotless reputation. I need time to think about this, Jack said. Pemberton stood and handed him a business card. Of course, but Mr. Holloway, I should mention that we're not the only ones interested in this situation. There are other parties, less reasonable parties, who might not be as generous with their offers. After Pemberton left, Jack and Sarah sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Sarah spoke. Jack, I think we're in over our heads. I think Eleanor knew this day would come, Jack replied, picking up the compass. I think that's why she made sure her story would survive, even if she couldn't. Outside, a black sedan was parked across the street, its occupants watching Jack's house with the kind of patience that suggested they were being paid very well to wait. 3 nights after Pemberton's visit, Jack couldn't sleep. He sat in his study at 2 in the morning, turning Eleanor's journal over in his hands, when he noticed something he'd missed before. The binding was slightly loose at the back, and when he pressed on it, he felt something crinkle beneath the leather. Using a letter opener, he carefully separated the binding from the back cover. Hidden inside was a folded piece of oiled cloth, and wrapped within that was a hand-drawn map that made his breath catch in his throat. The map was clearly Eleanor's work, drawn in the same careful script as her journal entries. It showed the coastline near Lobster Cove with remarkable accuracy, marking specific landmarks that Jack recognized from his decades of fishing these waters. But most importantly, it showed an X marked on a small island about 3 miles offshore, an island Jack knew well, because he'd often anchored there during storms. At the bottom of the map, Eleanor had written, "For my descendant who finds this, what I could not give you in life, I leave you in death. The truth is buried where the sea meets the sky, waiting for someone brave enough to claim it. Follow the compass when it points. True north, and you will find what Catherine meant for you to have." Jack's hands shook as he examined the map more closely. Eleanor had included specific navigation instructions, tidal charts, and even warnings about underwater rocks. This wasn't a casual treasure map. It was a carefully planned guide created by someone who knew these waters intimately. But how was that possible? According to everything he'd learned, Eleanor had arrived in Maine as Margaret O'Brien and lived in a small inland town. How would she have known the coastal waters around Lobster Cove well enough to create such a detailed map? He looked at the compass, and for the first time since he'd found it, the needle was pointing steadily north. Not magnetic north, which would have been slightly off, but true north, exactly as Eleanor had written. "Sarah," he said into his phone, not caring that it was after midnight, "I found something. You need to come over." "Jack? It's 2 in the morning. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, but this can't wait. Eleanor left us a map." Sarah arrived within 20 minutes, her hair still messy from sleep, but her eyes alert with curiosity. When Jack showed her the map, she sat down heavily in his desk chair. "Jack, this changes everything. Eleanor didn't just disappear into inland Maine. She came here, to Lobster Cove. She knew these waters, but that's impossible. The records show Margaret O'Brien lived 40 miles inland. She worked in a textile mill, raised Thomas in a small town. There's no record of her ever living near the coast." Sarah studied the map under Jack's desk lamp. "Unless Margaret O'Brien wasn't Eleanor's only identity. Look at the detail in this map, Jack. This was drawn by someone who spent years learning these waters, someone who lived here." The implications hit Jack like a cold wave. "You think Eleanor created more than one false identity?" "I think Eleanor was far more resourceful than we've given her credit for. She didn't just survive the Titanic and disappear. She created an entire network of identities that allowed her to move between different lives as needed." Jack thought about the mysterious boat where he'd found Eleanor's belongings. A boat that had appeared in his fishing grounds and then vanished from Coast Guard radar. "Sarah, what if the boat I found wasn't just carrying Eleanor's things? What if it was Eleanor's boat?" "You mean she lived here, in Lobster Cove?" "I mean she might have lived everywhere she needed to live. Margaret O'Brien working in the textile mill, but also someone else living on the coast. Someone who knew how to navigate these waters like a born fisherman." Jack picked up the compass again. "Someone who owned a boat." Sarah was already pulling out her laptop. "I can check historical records for the area. If Eleanor had another identity here, there might be traces." While Sarah worked, Jack studied the map more carefully. Eleanor had marked not just the location where something was buried, but also what looked like a safe route to reach it. She'd noted tidal patterns, seasonal wind changes, and even marked what appeared to be underwater hazards. "Jack," Sarah said suddenly, "I found something. In 1915, a woman named Emma Holloway purchased a small cottage here in Lobster Cove. She's listed as a widow from Ireland, and she owned a fishing boat called the Catherine's Gift." Jack felt his heart stop. Catherine's Gift, named after William's wife. It gets better. Emma Holloway lived here for 3 years, then disappeared in 1918, the same year that Margaret O'Brien inherited the 40-acre property. "Jack, I think Eleanor was living as both women simultaneously. But how is that possible?" The textile mill where Margaret worked was seasonal. Workers were laid off for months at a time during slow periods. Eleanor could have come here during those breaks, established Emma as a local identity, learned the waters, built a life as a fisherman. Jack looked at the map again, seeing it with new understanding. Eleanor hadn't just survived the Titanic. She'd used the disaster as an opportunity to become whoever she needed to be. Margaret O'Brien for respectability and steady work, Emma Holloway for freedom and access to the sea. But why here? Why Lobster Cove specifically? Sarah pointed to something else on the map that Jack had missed. In small letters near the shoreline, Eleanor had written, "Where the Celtic Star ran aground, 1847. The Celtic Star was a ship that brought Irish immigrants to Maine during the potato famine," Sarah explained. "It ran aground right here in Lobster Cove, and most of the passengers stayed and founded the local Irish community. Eleanor was following family history. She came here because other Holloways had come here. More than that, I think she came here because she knew she'd be welcomed. The Irish community in Lobster Cove was tight-knit, protective of their own. They would have helped a widow named Emma without asking too many questions." Jack stood and walked to his window, looking out at the dark ocean where Eleanor had once sailed her boat. "She orchestrated all of this. The boat I found, the compass, pointing north, even the timing of when I'd find everything. Eleanor planned for one of her descendants to uncover the truth. But why now? Why after more than a century? Jack thought about Pemberton's visit and the black sedan that had been parked across the street for 3 days. Because someone else is getting close to the truth, and Eleanor wanted her family to find it first. Sarah joined him at the window. Jack, if Eleanor buried something on that island, something Catherine Ashworth meant for Thomas to have, then we need to find it. Before Pemberton and his people do. Jack picked up the compass one more time. Its needle was pointing steadily toward the island marked on Eleanor's map. Eleanor waited over a century for the right person to find her secrets. I'm not going to let her down now. But as they prepared to leave, Jack noticed something that made his blood run cold. The black sedan was gone, but in its place was a small boat anchored just outside the harbor. Someone else was watching, and they were a lot closer to Eleanor's island than Jack was comfortable with. The race to uncover Eleanor's final secret had begun, and Jack wasn't the only one with a map. At dawn, Jack found the final letter sealed, in a separate envelope tucked behind Eleanor's map. The envelope was addressed in her careful script, "To my descendant who finds this." His hands trembled as he broke the wax seal that had protected Eleanor's last words for over a century. "My dear unknown heir," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the compass has pointed true and you have found what I hoped you would find. By now you know that I was not the simple woman my son believed me to be. I was many women. Eleanor, Margaret, Emma, each one necessary for survival in a world that offered few choices to those like me. But I was also something else, something I could never tell my Thomas or anyone else. I was a guardian of secrets, a keeper of truths that powerful people would kill to protect. The Ashworth family's generosity came with a price, and that price was my silence about what really happened on the Titanic." Jack paused, his heart racing. Eleanor's letter was confirming his worst fears. There was more to the Titanic story than anyone knew. William Ashworth did not die accidentally in the sinking. He was murdered, pushed overboard by someone who discovered he was carrying documents that could destroy several prominent Boston families. I witnessed this crime, and the killer saw me, watching. That is why I could never surface as Eleanor Holloway again. That is why Catherine Ashworth really helped me disappear, not from guilt about her husband's treatment of me, but from fear that the truth about his death would surface. The documents William died protecting are buried on the island marked in my map. Catherine gave them to me before she died, begging me to hide them where no one would think to look. She knew that as long as those papers existed, both she and I would be in danger. For over a century I have kept them safe, but now I am old and my time is ending. I leave this burden to you, my descendant, trusting that you will have the courage I sometimes lacked. Jack set the letter down, his mind reeling. Eleanor hadn't just survived the Titanic, she'd witnessed a murder and spent her entire life protecting. Evidence that could expose some of Boston's most powerful families. Sarah arrived as he was finishing the letter, bringing coffee and a look of grim determination. "I've been researching all night," she said. "Emma Holloway, Eleanor's fishing identity. She was more connected to this community than we realized. She helped other immigrants who needed to disappear, provided boat passage for people who couldn't go through official channels. She was running an underground railroad for people who needed new identities." Exactly. And Jack, I think that's how she supported herself. The textile millwork was just cover. Her real income came from helping people disappear. Jack showed Sarah the letter, watching her face change as she read Eleanor's revelations about William's murder. When she finished, she looked up with a mixture of awe and terror. Jack, if this is true, then Eleanor wasn't just hiding from personal scandal. She was hiding from murderers. And those murderers might still be alive, or their children might be. Before Sarah could respond, Jack's phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the caller ID, and Jack could hear the tension in his son's voice. Immediately, Dad, where are you? There are two men at your house asking questions about you. They claim to be from some historical society, but they don't feel right. Jack's blood ran cold. What kind of questions? About your research? About documents you might have found? Dad, they're asking specifically about Titanic survivor records. I think these are the people Sarah was worried about. Where are you now? At the house with them. I told them you were out fishing, but I don't think they believed me. One of them keeps looking around like he's searching for something. Jack thought quickly. If Pemberton's people were at his house, they were running out of time. Michael, get out of there. Make some excuse and leave. Meet us at Tom Patterson's office at the harbor. Dad, what's going on? You're scaring me. I'll explain everything when I see you. Just get out of the house now. After hanging up, Jax turned to Sarah. They're moving faster than we expected. We need to get to that island today. Jack, this is getting dangerous. Maybe we should call the police. And tell them what? That we found a century-old letter claiming someone was murdered. On the Titanic? That we think powerful Boston families are trying to cover up a crime from 1912? Jack shook his head. They'd think we're crazy. Sarah looked at Eleanor's map, studying the careful navigation notes. Jack, even if we find what Eleanor buried, what then? If these documents really could destroy prominent families, they'll do anything to get them back. Then we make sure they can't get them back. We make the information public before they can stop us. You're talking about taking on some of the wealthiest, most powerful people in New England. People with resources we can't even imagine. Jack picked up Eleanor's compass, its needle still pointing steadily toward the island where her secrets waited. Eleanor took them on for over a century, and won. She kept their secrets buried and protected her family. Now it's my turn. An hour later, they met Michael at the harbor master's office. Tom Patterson took one look at their faces and closed the door behind them. What kind of trouble are you folks in? Tom asked. Because there've been some very official-looking people asking questions about you around town. Jack made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. He told Tom everything. The mysterious boat, Eleanor's journal, the evidence of murder on the Titanic, and the powerful people who wanted to keep it buried. When he finished, Tom was quiet for a long moment. Jack, I've known you for 20 years, and you're not the kind of man who makes up stories, but what you're telling me sounds like something out of a movie. I know how it sounds, but Tom, I need your help. I need to get to Gull Island today, and I need to do it without anyone knowing where I've gone. Tom looked at the map Eleanor had drawn, recognizing the landmarks and navigation notes. This map was drawn by someone who really knew these waters, someone who'd spent years fishing around here. Emma Holloway, Sarah said. She was a local fisherwoman from 1915 to 1918. Tom's eyes widened. Emma Holloway, I'll be damned. My grandfather used to tell stories about her, said she was the best boat handler he'd ever seen, could navigate in fog so thick you couldn't see your own hands. But she disappeared one day, just vanished like she'd never existed. She didn't disappear, Jack said. She just became someone else again. Michael, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. Dad, I want to come with you. Absolutely not. This is too dangerous. You're 72 years old, and you're going after buried treasure while being hunted by people who've already committed murder. You need backup. Michael's right, Tom said, and if you're really going to do this, you need someone who knows these waters like the back of his hand. I'm coming too. Sarah looked around the room at the three men who were volunteering to risk their lives for Eleanor's century-old secret. This is insane. We're not trained for this kind of thing. Neither was Eleanor, Jack said, but she did what needed to be done, and so will we. Tom pulled out charts of the area around Gull Island, comparing them to Eleanor's map. The tide will be right around noon. If we leave now, we can get there, do what we need to do, and be back before dark. As they prepared to leave, Jack looked back at the harbor where Eleanor had once sailed as Emma Holloway, protecting secrets that could have gotten her killed. He was about to follow in her footsteps, and he hoped he had inherited even a fraction of her courage. In the distance, A sleek powerboat was moving toward the harbor, its occupants clearly scanning the docks with professional intensity. Time was running out, and Eleanor's final test was about to begin. The journey to Gull Island took 45 minutes in Tom's sturdy fishing boat, but it felt like hours to Jack. Behind them, the sleek powerboat had followed at a distance, its occupants making no attempt to hide their surveillance. Eleanor's compass sat in Jack's lap, its needle pointing steadily toward their destination, as if it had been waiting over a century for this moment. "There," Tom said, pointing to a rocky outcrop barely visible above the high tide. "That's Gull Island. Not much to look at, but it's been there since the glaciers retreated." Jack studied Eleanor's map, comparing her landmarks to what he could see. The island was smaller than he'd expected, maybe an acre of rocky ground, covered with scrub grass and weathered by countless storms. But Eleanor's navigation notes were perfect. Every rock formation, every tidal pool, every safe approach was exactly where she'd marked it. "According to the map, we need to land on the south side," Jack said. "There's a small cove that's protected from the wind." As they approached the island, Sarah pointed to something that made Jack's heart race. "Look at that pile of rocks near the center. It's not natural. Someone built that cairn." The stone marker was exactly where Eleanor had drawn an X on her map. Even from the boat, Jack could see that the rocks had been carefully arranged to create a distinctive pattern, like a compass rose pointing in 4 directions. Tom maneuvered the boat into the shallow cove, but as they prepared to anchor, Michael spotted something alarming. "Dad, look behind us." The powerboat that had been following them was no longer hanging back. It was approaching fast, and Jack could see at least 4 people on board. One of them was holding what looked like binoculars, scanning the island with professional intensity. "They're not going to wait for us to finish," Tom said grimly. "Whatever you're looking for, we need to find it fast." Jack grabbed Eleanor's compass and the map, then jumped into the knee-deep water without hesitation. The shock of the cold Atlantic in early spring took his breath away, but adrenaline kept him moving toward shore. Sarah and Michael followed, while Tom stayed with the boat to watch for the approaching threat. The island's surface was rockier than it appeared from the water, covered with loose stones that shifted underfoot. Jack made his way toward Eleanor's cairn, using the compass to confirm their direction. As they got closer, he could see that the stone marker was more elaborate than he'd realized. It wasn't just a pile of rocks, but a carefully constructed monument that had survived over a century of Atlantic storms. "There's something carved into the base stone," Sarah said, kneeling beside the cairn. "It looks like coordinates." Jack knelt beside her, brushing away decades of accumulated debris. Carved into the granite base were numbers that matched the navigation notations on Eleanor's map, along with something else that made his hands shake. "TH, 1918. From EH, with love," he read aloud. "Thomas Holloway. Eleanor left this for my grandfather." The sound of a powerful boat engine made them all look up. The powerboat was almost at the island now, and Jack could see men in dark suits preparing to come ashore. "Jack, we need to hurry," Michael said urgently, following Eleanor's instructions. Jack began removing stones from the cairn in a specific pattern. The rocks had been placed with such precision that even after a century they came away easily when lifted in the right order. Beneath the stones was a metal box, green with age but still intact. Eleanor's time capsule was smaller than Jack had. Expected about the size of a shoebox, but made from heavy brass that had protected its contents from the elements. The lock was old, but functional, and Eleanor had thoughtfully included a key tied to the handle with a chain that had somehow survived decades of exposure. Inside the box, wrapped in oiled cloth that still showed traces of Eleanor's careful handwriting, were documents that made Jack's breath catch. Legal papers, photographs, letters, and what appeared to be financial records, all bearing the letterhead of prominent Boston families, including the Ashworths. "My God," Sarah whispered, looking over Jack's shoulder. "These are contracts, shipping, manifests, immigration records. Jack, this is evidence of a massive conspiracy." The documents told a story of corruption that reached the highest levels of Boston society. Shipping companies bribing immigration officials, wealthy families purchasing false identities for their scandals, and at the center of it all, a network of criminals who had been using Titanic survivors as cover for their operations. But the most damning document was a handwritten confession signed by someone named Harrison Pemberton and dated April 14th, 1912, the night before the Titanic sank. Pemberton, Jack said, recognizing the name, Richard Pemberton's ancestor. The confession detailed how Harrison Pemberton had been running an identity forging operation using passenger manifests from ships traveling to America. When William Ashworth discovered the scheme and threatened to expose it, Pemberton had followed him onto the Titanic and killed him during the chaos of the sinking. The sound of boots on rocks made them all turn. 4 men in dark suits were climbing onto the island, and the one in front looked exactly like Richard Pemberton, but younger and more dangerous. "Mr. Holloway," the man called out, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "I believe you have something that belongs to my family." Jack stood slowly, Eleanor's time capsule clutched in his hands, facing the man who looked so much like Richard Pemberton that it was unsettling. But this man was younger, harder, with the kind of cold confidence that came from never hearing the word no. "You must be Harrison's great-grandson," Jack said, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. "Harrison Pemberton IV, the man replied, stepping closer with his 3 companions. "And you're holding documents that could destroy everything." "My family is built over the past century." Sarah moved protectively closer to Jack. "Built on murder and fraud, you mean?" Harrison's smile was as cold as the Atlantic wind. "Built on pragmatism and survival, Ms. Chen. My great-grandfather understood that sometimes difficult decisions must be made for the greater good." "The greater good?" Michael stepped forward, his lawyer instincts kicking in even in this surreal situation. "You're talking about murder. I'm talking about protecting thousands of jobs, dozens of charitable organizations, and institutions that have done immeasurable good for over a century," Harrison replied. "One man's death, a man who was about to destroy all of that out of misguided principle, seems like a reasonable trade." Jack looked down at the brass time capsule, thinking about Eleanor's courage in preserving these secrets for over a century. Inside this box was evidence that could rewrite history, expose corruption at the highest levels, and finally give William Ashworth the justice he'd been denied. But it was also evidence that could destroy innocent people whose only crime was being born into families built on lies. "What do you want?" Jack asked. "I want you to do what Eleanor Holloway should have done a century ago," Harrison said. "Throw that box into the ocean and walk away. In return, I'll make sure you and your family are very well compensated for your cooperation." "How well compensated?" $10 million, transferred to accounts of your choosing within 24 hours. Enough for you, your children, and your grandchildren to live comfortably for the rest of their lives." Sarah gasped. Even Michael looked stunned by the offer. $10 million was more money than any of them had ever imagined having. "And if I refuse?" Jack asked. Harrison's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes turned darker. "Then we'll be forced to protect our family's interests through other means. Accidents happen, Mr. Holloway, even to careful fishermen who know these waters." Well, the threat hung in the air between them like fog. Jack realized he was looking at a man who was entirely capable of making good on that threat, just as his great-grandfather had made good on his threat to William Ashworth. But then Jack thought about Eleanor's final letter, about the courage it had taken for her to preserve these secrets while living in constant fear. He thought about Catherine Ashworth, who had tried to make amends for her husband's death. He thought about his grandfather Thomas, who had lived his entire life not knowing his mother was a hero. Jack opened the time capsule and pulled out Eleanor's wedding ring, the ring she'd never gotten to wear, the symbol of the love that had been stolen from her by Harrison's great-grandfather. Eleanor Holloway was braver than any of us, Jack said, holding up the ring so it caught the afternoon sunlight. She could have sold these secrets, used them for blackmail, made herself rich. Instead, she protected them until someone worthy could decide what to do with them. She was a fool, Harrison said, and her foolishness nearly destroyed my family. Your family destroyed itself the moment your great-grandfather decided murder was an acceptable business practice. Jack looked at his son, at Sarah, at Tom still, waiting by the boat. These people had risked their lives to help him uncover the truth. They deserved better than to have that truth buried again by blood money and threats. I know what Eleanor would want me to do, Jack said, closing the time capsule. But this isn't her decision anymore. It's mine. He walked to the edge of the island, where the waves were breaking against the rocks. For a moment, Harrison and his men thought Jack was going to throw the evidence into the ocean. Instead, Jack pulled out his cell phone. "What are you doing?" Harrison demanded. "I'm calling my daughter," Jack said. "Lisa is a nurse, but she's also very good with social media. I think Eleanor's story deserves to be told to the world, don't you?" Harrison's composure finally cracked. "Mr. Holloway, you don't understand what you're doing. The people who depend on my family's foundations, the researchers who rely on our grants, the hospitals we fund, will find other sources of support," Jack interrupted. "Sources that aren't built on murder and lies." As Jack dialed Lisa's number, Harrison made a gesture to his companions. They began moving closer, and Jack realized the negotiation phase was over. But then Tom's voice carried across the water from their boat. "I don't think so, gentlemen. Coast Guard cutter approaching from the southeast. Looks like someone called in a distress signal," Jack smiled, looking down at Eleanor's compass one final time. Its needle was no longer pointing north. It was pointing directly at Harrison Pemberton, as if Eleanor herself was identifying her family's enemy. "Eleanor waited over a century for justice," Jack said. "I think it's time she got it. 6 months." Later, Jack stood in his backyard garden, watching his granddaughter Emma chase butterflies among the flowers Martha had planted years ago. The garden was thriving again, tended with the same care Jack was learning to give to the rest of his life. Eleanor's story had made headlines around the world. The documents from her time capsule had exposed a century-old conspiracy that reached into some of Boston's most prominent families, resulting in congressional investigations and the collapse of several charitable foundations built on blood money. Harrison Pemberton IV was facing federal charges for conspiracy and extortion, while his family's shipping empire crumbled under the weight of its revealed history. But for Jack, the most important revelation had been simpler and more personal. In Eleanor's effects, Sarah had found something that changed everything he thought he knew about love and family. "Grandpa Jack," Emma called out, holding up a butterfly that had landed on her finger. "Look what I found." "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Jack said, walking over to admire the delicate creature. "Your great-great-great-grandmother Eleanor would have loved to see that." Emma giggled at the long string of greats, but Jack had been teaching her about Eleanor's story in terms a 6-year-old could understand. She knew that their family had come from a brave woman who survived a famous shipwreck and spent her life protecting important secrets. Sarah emerged from the house carrying a pitcher of lemonade and the warm smile that had become such a welcome part of Jack's daily routine. They'd been taking things slowly, 2 people in their 70s, learning to trust in unexpected second chances, but every day brought them closer together. "Any word from the museum curator?" she asked, settling into the chair beside his. "They want to create a permanent exhibit about Eleanor and the other Titanic survivors who disappeared into new identities," Jack said. "They're calling it The Invisible Survivors, Hidden Stories from History's Greatest Maritime Disaster." It felt right that Eleanor's story would be preserved for future generations, told properly this time, without the lies and omissions that had shaped Jack's family narrative for so long. Michael appeared in the garden gate, carrying a folder of legal documents and looking pleased with himself. "Dad, I have good news." The probate court has officially recognized your claim to the 40-acre property. It's yours, free and clear. Jack looked out toward the ocean, thinking about the land Catherine Ashworth had left in trust for Eleanor's descendants. 40 acres of pristine Maine coastline, worth millions of dollars, but more valuable to Jack for what it represented. A final act of redemption from a woman trying to make amends for her husband's murder. "What are you going to do with it?" Sarah asked. Jack had been thinking about that question for months. The easy answer would be to sell it, secure his family's financial future, and retire to a life of comfortable obscurity. But Eleanor's story had taught him that easy answers weren't always the right answers. "I'm going to turn it into a memorial," he said. "Not just for Eleanor, but for all the Titanic survivors whose stories were lost or forgotten. A place where people can come to remember that history is more complicated than the official versions we tell ourselves." Emma ran over and climbed into Jack's lap, her small hands still dirty from the garden. "Will there be butterflies there too, Grandpa?" "Lots of butterflies," Jack promised, thinking about Eleanor's transformation from a frightened young woman into someone strong enough to outwit Boston's criminal elite for over a century. Lisa arrived with her family for their weekly Sunday dinner. A tradition that had started after Eleanor's story became public and had brought the scattered Holloway family back together. As they gathered around Martha's old table, Jack looked at the faces of his children and grandchildren and felt something he hadn't experienced since his wife's death: complete contentment. "Before we eat," he said, raising his glass of water, "I want to make a toast to Eleanor Holloway, who taught us that family isn't just about the stories we inherit, but about the courage to write new ones." "To Eleanor," they all echoed, and Jack felt Martha's presence in the room as clearly as if she was sitting beside him. After dinner, as the family played board games and the children ran through the house, Jack and Sarah walked down to the harbor. The sun was setting over Lobster Cove, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Jack of Eleanor's compass needle finding true north. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found that boat?" Sarah asked. Jack considered the question. 6 months ago, he'd been a lonely widower going through the motions of living, trapped by grief and isolation. Eleanor's mystery had given him purpose, but more than that, it had given him the courage to open his heart again. "I think Eleanor knew exactly what she was doing," he said. "She waited until someone in her family needed to find her as much as she needed to be found." In his pocket, he carried the new family photograph they'd taken that afternoon. 4 generations of Holloways gathered together, along with Sarah, who had become family in all the ways that mattered. It was a far cry from the collection of old pictures and painful memories that had once defined his connection to the past. Eleanor's compass sat on his mantle now, its needle finally at rest, pointing toward a future filled with possibilities Jack was still learning to embrace. Sometimes the greatest treasures weren't gold or jewels, but the courage to start over and the wisdom to recognize that it's never too late for a new beginning. As they walked back toward the house, Jack could hear his family's laughter carrying on the evening breeze, and he knew that Eleanor's greatest legacy wasn't the secrets she'd protected or the wealth she'd preserved. It was the reminder that family stories don't end. They just find new chapters and new voices to tell them. The mysterious boat had never reappeared, but Jack no longer needed it to find his way home.